The dust of a forgotten Wyoming town, called Redemption Hole with cruel irony, was the same color as the despair that coated everything there. A washed-out, lifeless gray. It was late afternoon, the sun low and merciless, casting long, hungry shadows. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, wood smoke, and the thin, sharp scent of dried tears. Standing near the rear door of the town's only saloon was Elias Eli Vance, a man built like a redwood tree after a decade of rough weather. He was a giant, not just tall but wide, his shoulders straining the seams of his leather coat, his hands big enough to palm a saddle horn. Eli was the owner of the vast, prosperous Double V Ranch 10 miles out, a man respected and, frankly, a little feared. But right now, his eyes, usually focused on cattle and fencing, were locked on a small, dark doorway, and they held a slow, gathering storm. He wasn't there for a drink. He was there because he'd heard the whispers. In a place and time where women were often seen as property, the whispers in Redemption Hole were particularly ugly. They centered on Clara, a woman who had come from a good, proud family back east, but whose life here had been crushed beneath the weight of small-town cruelty and a cruel husband named Silas. The latest whisper, the one that drove Eli's wagon wheels into the gray dust of the town, was that Silas had beaten her for the newest, most unforgivable sin, giving birth to their third daughter. In that unforgiving world, a man needed sons for labor, for inheritance, for pride. A man like Silas saw 3 daughters as a curse, a sign of failure, and he punished the messenger. Eli had seen the marks before. Fading bruises, eyes that held a permanent flinch. But this time, it was different. This time, the beating had been public, brutal, and delivered with a chilling, self-righteous anger. Eli waited, silent as the mountain peaks that ringed the valley. He wasn't a hero in the painted novel sense. He was a rancher who believed in justice, but his definition of justice was simple and uncompromising. You don't hurt what can't fight back. Especially not over the gender of a baby. That wasn't traditional. That was savagery. Finally, the back door creaked open, and Clara emerged. She wasn't carrying a bucket or a bag. She was carrying a small, bundled blanket, her newest daughter only days old. Clara was tiny, delicate, yet etched with an almost unbreakable pride in the set of her jaw. But everything else about her was broken. Her right eye was swollen shut, her lips split, and she moved with a slow, agonizing stiffness. Her dress, once a bright, hopeful blue, was stained with the telltale, dark splotches of blood and dust. She looked like a bird with a broken wing, trying desperately to shelter its young. The sight hit Eli in the gut like a hammer blow. It was the absolute, stark gravity of the situation made visible. Clara moved carefully toward the small, dilapidated wagon she and Silas used. She didn't look up, trained by years of misery to avoid all eyes. She wanted to disappear into the gray. A shout cut the air, shattering the tense silence. Silas, fueled by whiskey and misplaced masculine fury, staggered out of the saloon. He was a slight weasel of a man, but his voice was loud and sharp with toxic authority. "Where you going with that thing, woman?" Silas slurred, pointing a shaking finger at the baby. "Get back inside and clean up this mess you made. 3 mouths to feed, all useless girls. I ought to throw that last one in the trough." Clara flinched violently, clutching the baby tighter to her chest. For the first time, she stopped moving toward the wagon. She planted her feet, a tiny act of resolution, a mother's instinct overriding years of ingrained fear. She wouldn't let him touch her daughter. Silas took a step toward her, his face twisted into a mask of drunken rage. This was the moment Eli had been waiting for. He uncoiled from the shadow of the building, his massive frame suddenly filling the street. Silas stopped dead, recognizing the shadow. Everyone in Redemption Hole knew not to cross Eli Vance. But the whiskey was talking now, laced with the bitter poison of envy for Eli's success. "What are you looking at, Vance?" Silas spat. "Mind your own damn ranch. This here's my property. And my woman. I'll discipline my own brood." Eli walked slowly toward them, his heavy, work-worn boots crunching on the dusty road. He stopped directly between Silas and Clara. The difference in size was ludicrous, terrifying. Eli had to look down to meet Silas's eyes, and when he did, his voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that promised disaster. "She ain't property, Silas," Eli said. "She's a woman, a mother, and you're a bully who hits someone smaller than you. Stay out of it." Silas shrieked, momentarily forgetting his fear. He lunged forward, his pathetic attempt at a fist aimed at Eli's chest. Eli didn't flinch. He didn't even use his hands. He simply took a single, controlled step forward, and the sheer momentum of his immense body was enough. Silas stumbled back, losing his balance and landing hard on the ground in a cloud of gray dust. He lay there, stunned, humiliated, a broken piece of driftwood against a tidal wave. Eli ignored him completely. He turned his attention to Clara, his posture instantly softening. He kept his giant hands at his sides, palm open, showing them empty and harmless. He lowered his gaze to meet hers, forcing her to look up, to see the sincerity in his storm-colored eyes. "Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a powerful, gentle whisper that held the weight of the vast, quiet plains. He didn't offer her judgment, pity, or even protection yet. He offered her a choice. "Come with me," the giant rancher said to the woman beaten for giving birth to 3 daughters. His next words were the real hook, the emotional anchor that spoke not to her fear, but to her deep, wounded pride. "I don't offer you a husband, Clara. I offer you a home. I offer your daughters a place where they'll be called blessings, not burdens. You and those girls deserve dignity. You deserve safety. You deserve to decide your own life. On the double V, a woman's value isn't measured by the sons she gives birth to. It's measured by the strength of her heart." He stepped back, leaving a clear path to his wagon, hitched just down the street. It was a fine, sturdy thing, built for long, necessary journeys, not for quick, desperate escapes. Clara stared at him, her one good eye searching his face, looking past the size and into the soul of the man. She saw no lust, no hidden agenda, only quiet, unshakable conviction. This was not an offer of servitude. It was an invitation to freedom. She looked at the pathetic, beaten figure of Silas, still coughing dust in the road, and then down at the small bundle in her arms, the helpless daughter who had caused her so much pain but who was now the key to her courage. She didn't speak. Her voice had been stolen long ago. Instead, she lifted her chin, just a fraction, a magnificent flicker of resolution in her broken body. She took a step away from Silas, a step away from the gray dust, and started walking toward the giant rancher's wagon. Each step was an act of pure, distilled will. She hadn't run. She had walked, deliberately and proudly, into her new life. Eli didn't rush her. He let her walk every foot of that journey herself. When she finally reached the sturdy wagon, he moved quickly, yet gently. He took the 3 small children, the newborn, and 2 slightly older girls who had been hiding beneath a blanket, and carefully placed them on the soft sheepskin he had laid on the seat. Then, with the utmost care, he helped Clara climb up, his big hands like warm, solid anchors against her slight frame. He picked up the reins, giving the horse a quiet command. They rode out of Redemption Hole and into the setting sun, leaving the gray dust and the shouting, futile rage of Silas behind them. Eli didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that the hardest part wasn't the escape. It was building the life that would come next. As they rode toward the distant silhouette of the Double V Ranch, the last rays of light caught the high mountain peaks, painting them in colors of gold and impossible hope. Clara looked forward, holding her daughters close, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to breathe the clean, promise-filled air of. The first 10 miles were the longest miles of Clara's life. The jolting of the wagon was a constant agony on her bruised body, but the pain was a dull whisper compared to the deafening silence of freedom. For so long, silence had meant waiting for the next blow. Now it meant no one was shouting. She held her newest baby, the tiny girl, against her chest, her 2 older daughters, Sarah, 5 years old, and Lily, 3 years old, nestled together under the sheepskin, quiet as mice, their large eyes watching the back of the giant man who had pulled them from the abyss. Eli drove the wagon with the steady, practiced hand of a man who knew his land and his purpose. He didn't look at Clara. He knew she needed space, not scrutiny. He focused on the horizon, but his awareness was entirely centered on the fragile group behind him. He spoke only to the horse, his voice a low, soothing murmur. This was not a courtship. It was a rescue, and his role was to be a wall of safety until Clara's own walls could come down. After they had put 5 miles between them and Redemption Hole, Eli finally stopped the wagon near a small, clear creek. The sun was beginning to dip, turning the sky into a vast canvas of orange and purple. "We'll stop here for water," Eli said, his voice slow and deliberate. He spoke to the air, giving Clara the option to respond or remain silent. "There's fresh water and I've got a sack of apples and some jerky. We won't be back to the Double V until dark." He waited a moment, then climbed down. He unhitched the horse and led it to the creek. When he returned, he pulled out a canvas-wrapped package. Inside were a blanket, a clean canteen, and a small first aid kit. He walked to the back of the wagon, still not meeting her eyes, and placed the items on the floorboards beside her. "The water's clean," he said, "and the kit's for your face. You don't have to talk about it. But you should tend to the swelling." He then turned away completely, walking a respectful distance to start a tiny, controlled fire for warmth, his back a massive barrier between her and the world. It was a profound act of dignity, offering help without demanding explanation or gratitude. He gave her back the ownership of her pain and her recovery. Clara watched him. For the first time in years, she felt the strange, unsettling weight of being treated like a human being. She looked at the first aid kit. The pain in her eye was throbbing, a constant reminder of Silas's final act of brutality. Slowly, tentatively, she reached for the clean rag and the antiseptic. As she gently dabbed the cuts, her 3-year-old, Lily, finally broke the silence. "Mama," Lily whispered, pointing her tiny finger at Eli's immense figure by the fire. "Is he a bear?" Clara managed a faint, shaky smile, the first true smile she'd worn in years. It was a painful, crooked thing, but it was real. "No, darlin'," Clara whispered back, her voice raspy from disuse and damage. "He's just a very big man, and he's our helper." When Eli returned, he didn't ask if she'd used the kit. He just looked at her, then offered a piece of dried apple to Sarah, the eldest girl. "You must be hungry, Sarah," he said gently. "This is a good, sweet apple, my favorite kind." Sarah took the apple, her eyes still wide but now flicking with curiosity instead of pure fear. Lily took one too, after watching her big sister. Clara hadn't eaten. She was too tense, too used to eating only when told. "Clara," Eli said, his voice shifting to a more formal, necessary tone. "When we get to the ranch, I want to be clear about the arrangement. I have a housekeeper, an older woman named Mrs. Davies. She'll be there. The house is large. You will have your own wing, 3 bedrooms, a sitting room, and a private bath. The doors have locks. You will be paid a salary for managing the house, including supervising Mrs. Davies. It is an honest wage for honest work." He paused, letting her process the word salary. "Paid, not kept, not owned. The most important part," he continued, his gaze intense, "is that you are free. You are free to leave, free to stay in your rooms, free to educate your girls. You owe me nothing but the dignity of not letting that man find you. Silas will be served divorce papers tomorrow, but I will need your testimony when the time comes." Clara finally spoke, the words scratching against her throat. "Why?" It was a single, raw, devastating question. Why risk so much for a stranger with 3 useless daughters? Eli looked out over the darkening plains. "Because, Clara, a man's worth isn't in his size or his gold. It's in the justice he is willing to fight for. And that man back there, he needed to be taught a lesson in being human. You and your daughters were the victims of his ignorance, but you are not defined by it. Your life, and their lives have immense value. That is why. He gave her a piece of the jerky, then turned back to the fire. He was establishing the fundamental principle of their new life: value, dignity, and justice. By the time they reached the Double V, the moon was high. The ranch was enormous. A dark silhouette of barns, corrals, and a sprawling, two-story house that looked like a fortress of light against the night. It was an intimidating sight. Mrs. Davies, a stout woman with a no-nonsense face and surprisingly kind eyes, met them at the door. She moved efficiently, taking the babies and the two older girls, her quiet competence instantly putting Clara at ease. Eli led Clara to her new rooms. He opened the door and stood aside. The rooms were clean, warm, and decorated simply but comfortably. There were 3 beds, a rocking chair, and a small, carved crib ready for the newborn. The outside door locks from the inside if you feel the need, Eli said, pointing to a heavy bolt. And I sleep on the other side of the house. No one will bother you. Rest, Clara. You are home now. He paused at the doorway, his immense presence filling the frame. He looked at her one last time, his gaze holding hers with unwavering respect. Your courage today was the greatest act of resolution I've ever witnessed, he stated simply. Never forget that. Sleep well. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Clara leaned back against the solid oak, listening to the silence of safety. She looked at her 3 daughters, already asleep in the clean beds, and then at the bolted door. The lock, once a symbol of imprisonment, was now the glorious instrument of her freedom. She was beaten, bruised, and penniless, but she was free, and she was in a place where her children were called blessings. In the vast, cruel West, a giant man had risked everything to prove that dignity and justice were not just whispered words, but hard-fought realities. She sank onto the soft bed, the tension finally leaving her, and for the first time in years, she felt the deep, profound exhaustion of a battle truly won. The work of healing and rebuilding had just begun, but the cornerstone, the foundation of respect, was firmly laid. The first week at the Double V was an unnerving stretch of absolute safety. For Clara and her 3 girls, Sarah, Lily, and the baby, whom Clara had quietly named Hope, the enormous, quiet ranch house was both a sanctuary and a prison of their own making. Clara kept the bolted door to her wing shut tight. She barely saw Eli. He worked the vast ranch from dawn until well after dark, his presence only announced by the smell of leather and dust when he passed through the main house to eat the meals Mrs. Davies prepared. Mrs. Davies was the bridge, a stern, kind woman with hands that smelled of yeast and lavender. She treated Clara and the girls with unwavering respect. She was paid by Eli, but her loyalty was to what was right. She showed Clara the workings of the house, the immense pantry, and the bookkeeping ledgers. It was in these ledgers that Clara, who had a good education, found her first foothold of purpose. Silas had always belittled Clara's skills, confining her to backbreaking, menial chores. Here, Eli had tasked her with managing. Clara realized this wasn't charity. It was a job given to someone deemed capable. This simple act, respect for her intellect, was more healing than any medicine. One afternoon, while Eli was working in the main barn, Clara found a problem in the ledgers. The prices being paid for certain ranch supplies, particularly medical gauze and grain, seemed wildly inflated compared to the market rates she remembered from her father's time. It wasn't simple overcharging. It looked like a systematic swindling by the supplier, possibly in collusion with one of the ranch hands who handled the deliveries. This was a terrifying realization. Reporting it meant stepping out of the protection of her silence and challenging the system Eli had in place. If she was wrong, she risked proving Silas right, that she was useless and unworthy of trust. If she was right, she was putting herself and Eli into a conflict that could be dangerous. But the thought of Eli, who had shown her such immense dignity and justice, being cheated under his own roof was intolerable. Her conscience, long buried by fear, roared back to life. Clara spent 2 days double-checking every figure, her bruised eye throbbing, her hand cramping as she wrote. Finally, she prepared a clear, concise report, detailing the discrepancies and pointing to the only ranch hand who had always insisted on signing for those specific deliveries. A shifty man named Garth. She didn't leave the report. She knew such a grave accusation needed to be delivered with courage and in person. She waited until after dinner, when the girls were asleep, the bolt on her door remaining, for the moment, slid shut. She put on the cleanest dress she owned, straightened her shoulders, and walked across the wide, echoing hall to the parlor where Eli was usually reading. Eli looked up from a newspaper as she walked in. He wasn't wearing his coat, just a simple shirt that made his sheer size even more imposing. He looked surprised but not displeased. He immediately placed his newspaper down, giving her his full, quiet attention. "Clara," he said, acknowledging her first unannounced entry into the main house. "Is everything all right? Are the girls well?" "The girls are well," Clara affirmed, her voice a little stronger than the last time she spoke, fueled now by purpose. She walked to the large mahogany desk, her movements precise, placing the ledger and her notes in the center of the desk. She did not stand timidly by the door. She stood by the desk, a gesture of equal footing. "Mr. Vance," she began, using the formal address. "I have found a problem. A large one. The costs recorded here for grain and medical supplies are inflated by nearly 20%. It has been happening for 6 months, possibly longer. We have lost hundreds of dollars." The pattern points to one of the supply runs handled by Garth. She waited, her breath held tight. She expected doubt, perhaps even anger at the suggestion of betrayal. Eli didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He picked up her careful report first, reading every word, every calculation she had made. His expression remained unreadable, serious. He spent a long minute studying the paper, the silence in the vast room growing heavy with the potential outcome of her revelation. Finally, he looked up, not at the ledger but directly at Clara. His eyes held an immense, quiet respect. "You risked a great deal to bring this to me, Clara," Eli said, his voice low. "You put yourself in harm's way again, not for yourself, but for the justice of this ranch. That is the true measure of a partner." He didn't question her numbers. He didn't ask how she knew. He simply believed her, honoring her intelligence and her courage. "I have suspected Garth of being shifty," Eli admitted, a rare crack of vulnerability in his armor. "But I lacked proof. Your work here is meticulous. It is proof." He tapped the paper. "Thank you. You have already saved the Double V far more than I'll ever pay you." He didn't make a grand gesture or a promise of immediate retribution. He simply absorbed the facts and began to formulate a plan that involved a quiet, immediate investigation and a decisive act of justice. "Tomorrow I'll ride to town," Eli said. "I'll confirm these prices myself and I'll handle Garth. No shouting, no mess, just a clear, final resolution." He stood, walking around the desk to stand beside her. He looked down at her, not dominating, but simply sharing the space. "You did the right thing, Clara. You faced down a different kind of bully tonight. Go rest. I'll make sure nothing here is broken." Clara finally allowed herself to feel the relief, a shaky wave of exhaustion washing over her. She gave a small nod, a final acknowledgement of their joint success. As she turned to leave, Eli spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Clara," he said, "the bolt on your door, does it stay locked out of fear now or just habit?" It was a delicate question, gently probing the progress of her healing. Clara stopped. She knew the answer. Silas no longer haunted her sleep. The fear of external danger had been replaced by the quiet courage of responsibility. She turned and looked at the giant rancher, the man who believed in her mind, not just her capacity for labor. "Habit," she admitted, her first true, open answer. "And, out of respect for the arrangement, Mr. Vance." "Eli," he corrected softly. "My name is Eli. The arrangement is built on respect, Clara. And respect doesn't need a lock. Good night." Clara walked back to her rooms. This time, as she closed the heavy door, she didn't slide the bolt home. She left it open, just a fraction. A silent, symbolic declaration that the dignity she had earned was stronger than any barrier, and that the trust between them had passed its first critical test. In the center of the parlor desk, Eli Vance sat, his huge hands resting on her neat, courageous report, planning a swift act of justice for the woman who dared to believe in the truth. The sun hadn't fully risen when Eli left the Double V the next morning. He hadn't told Clara his plan, but his quiet, resolute manner spoke volumes. He carried no rifle, only the weight of moral resolution and Clara's meticulously prepared report. He rode directly to the small supply town, confirming the inflated prices, then found Garth, the dishonest ranch hand, at the saloon. Eli didn't shout, he didn't even raise his voice. He simply showed Garth the figures, the cold, irrefutable proof of his theft. The conversation was brief, quiet, and absolutely final. Garth was paid what was owed, given his walking papers, and told never to set foot on Double V land again. The swift, unsentimental nature of the justice was a reflection of Eli's unwavering character. When Eli returned that afternoon, he found Clara in the main kitchen, not in her private wing. She was organizing the pantry, her small frame surrounded by sacks of flour and jars of preserves. She saw the dust on his boots and the tired determination on his face. She knew instinctively that the matter was handled. "Garth is gone," Eli stated simply, walking past her to wash his hands at the sink. "He won't be troubling the ranch or my ledgers again. You saved me a great deal of money, Clara, but more importantly, you reminded me that trust is the most valuable thing on this ranch. Thank you." His acknowledgement was genuine and without fanfare, treating her not as a grateful dependent, but as a respected partner who had executed her duty with courage. "It was my responsibility, Eli," Clara replied, using his first name naturally for the first time, a sign of their shifting dynamic. "You gave me the job. I take pride in the honesty of the Double V." That evening, the atmosphere in the large house was noticeably lighter. The removal of a dishonest hand was like clearing stale air. The girls, sensing the stability, began to emerge. Sarah and Lily, emboldened, ventured into the main parlor, drawing pictures with chalk on a small slate Eli had found for them. Clara sat nearby, her face focused as she mended one of Eli's worn work shirts. It was in this moment of fragile domestic peace that the next challenge arrived. A lawyer from Redemption Hole, a man named Mr. Hastings, rode up to the ranch. He carried a summons and a demand. Silas was petitioning the court to force Clara's return and gain full custody of the girls, claiming that Eli had abducted his property and that Clara was an unfit mother who had abandoned her duties. The sight of the official document shattered the calm. Eli read the summons, his face hardening into an expression Clara had only seen once, when he faced down Silas in the street. This was legal cruelty, a bureaucratic act of discrimination against a woman who dared to seek dignity. "He's using the law," Eli ground out, crushing the paper in his fist. "Claiming you abandoned him and the children. Claiming his right as the husband." Clara went white, clutching the mending in her hands. The panic was instantaneous and total. The security she had earned was suddenly paper-thin. Silas wasn't just a brute, he was a legal threat. He knew the law in that time and place favored the husband, the man who had the name and the standing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the old fear threatening to swallow her whole. "He can't," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I won't let him take the girls. He can beat me, but he won't raise them in that hate. They are all I have. They are my pride." Eli knelt before her, a mountain of a man bending his knee to meet her gaze. He put his large, warm hands over her small, trembling ones. This was not a business transaction. This was a shared fight for their freedom. "Listen to me, Clara," Eli said, his voice slow and commanding. "You did not abandon anyone. You escaped a life-threatening situation. We have witnesses who saw his violence. We have the proof on your face. We are going to fight this and we will win. Not because of money, but because the truth is on our side." He paused, his eyes conveying a deep, personal promise. "But to fight, we need to show the judge that the girls are safe, happy, and that you are their competent mother. We also need to show the judge that the girls have a stable, reputable home. And Clara, in the eyes of the law, that home needs to be officially recognized. Eli took a deep breath, knowing the magnitude of the next words. He was about to cross the final boundary of their professional arrangement, driven not by desire, but by the necessity of justice and the protection of her children. Clara, we need to get married, he stated, making the proposition sound like a battlefield strategy, not a romantic plea. It's the fastest, cleanest way to establish a legal and respected home for you and the girls. It strips Silas of his claims and gives you my name and my standing. We would marry for the safety of your daughters. I offer you my protection, my name, and the legal weight of the double V. Nothing more is required of you, ever, than your continued courage. The silence that followed was heavier than any physical conflict they had faced. Clara looked from the worried faces of her daughters to the resolute, honest eyes of Eli. She saw the absolute lack of expectation in his gaze. He was offering himself as a shield, a wall against the legal violence threatening to consume them. It was the ultimate act of selfless dignity. Eli, Clara finally replied, her voice steadying, drawing strength from the depth of his promise. You don't just offer me your name. You offer me a life without fear. And you offer my daughters a father who sees their value. She reached out and touched his cheek, a small, tender gesture that acknowledged the enormous personal cost of his offer. Yes, Clara said, the resolution in her voice ringing clear. I will marry you, for our daughters, and for the justice that must prevail against that man. Eli rose, the grimness replaced by a powerful sense of purpose. He picked up the crumpled summons and tossed it into the fireplace. Then the wedding will be in 3 days, he declared, his voice firm. We will face Silas with the weight of the law and with the unbreakable pride of the double V. This fight is ours, Clara, and we won't lose. The battle for her freedom had now become a fight for their legal future. The wedding was not a celebration of passionate love. It was an act of war fought with legality and resolution. 3 days after Eli's proposal, the ceremony took place in the large, austere parlor of the double V. Clara wore the same simple, blue dress she had arrived in, meticulously cleaned and pressed. Eli wore his best dark suit, his immense frame looking less like a rancher and more like an immovable force. The only witnesses were Mrs. Davies and a quiet, elderly justice of the peace Eli had brought from the county seat, a man known for his stern adherence to the letter of the law and his absolute intolerance for cruelty. Clara and Eli exchanged simple, spoken vows that were more about partnership and protection than romance. When the justice asked if there were any objections, the silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the gravity of their purpose. They were joined as husband and wife, legally and permanently, their bond forged in the necessity of courage and the pursuit of justice. Clara felt a profound, solid sense of peace wash over her, a deep anchor securing her against the approaching legal storm. She had a name, a standing, and an immense shield. 2 days later, Eli and Clara, dressed formally and radiating quiet confidence, walked into the small, dusty county courthouse. They sat together at the defendant's table. Clara held the newest baby, Hope, wrapped tightly. Sarah and Lily, scrubbed and quiet, sat on a bench, supervised by Mrs. Davies, who had insisted on being present. Silas, represented by the shifty Mr. Hastings, arrived looking pale, defiant, and deeply arrogant. He saw Clara sitting next to the giant rancher, holding a baby, and his face twisted with rage. He had expected her to be hiding, meek, or crying. He had expected an easy victory based on antiquated laws. He had not expected this public, dignified display of unity. The judge, a man with a tired face and sharp eyes, called the case. Silas's lawyer launched into a predictable, venomous attack, painting Clara as a neglectful, runaway wife who had been seduced by a wealthy rancher, abandoning her husband and home. His entire argument was based on the premise that Clara and the children were Silas's property. When it was Eli's turn, he didn't even stand. He spoke from his seat, his voice calm and deep, cutting through the lawyer's hysteria with the force of irrefutable truth. Your Honor, Eli began, looking directly at the judge. There are 3 simple truths here. First, Clara Vance, now my wife, did not run away from a home. She escaped a grave and continuing danger to her life and the lives of her children, documented by medical evidence of repeated battery, the most recent being a brutal beating for the crime of giving birth to a daughter. He paused, letting the word battery hang in the quiet room. Clara lifted her chin, her gaze steady, lending her dignity to the terrible truth. Second, her alleged abandonment of duty is absurd, Eli continued. Since she came to the Double V, she has proven herself to be a meticulous manager and a diligent, loving mother. I have legally adopted all 3 daughters, and they are thriving. Her supposed fault, giving birth to 3 girls, is the very reason I married her. I prize her pride in her daughters. Silas started to shout, "She's a liar. They're my blood." Eli ignored him, continuing directly to the judge. Third, and most important, we were married 3 days ago. Clara is now legally Mrs. Vance, under the full protection of my name and my assets. This is not a custody case, Your Honor. This is a frivolous attack based on a claim of ownership. There is no property here. There are only human beings who demand dignity and justice from the law. Then, in a move that startled the entire courtroom, Eli reached down and gently took the infant, Hope, from Clara's arms. He held the tiny baby against his massive chest, his huge, powerful hand cradling the child's head. Your Honor, Eli concluded, looking at the sleeping baby. The only question before this court is whether this infant, her 2 sisters, and their courageous mother should be forced back into a place of documented violence and hatred, or whether this court will uphold the most basic human right, the right to safety. The sight of the giant rancher, a symbol of the rugged West, holding a tiny infant with such profound, gentle care, spoke louder than any legal argument. The judge, whose eyes had been fixed on the baby, nodded slowly. He understood the visual language of the moment, the powerful symbol of protection and family resolution. The judge slammed his gavel down. Case dismissed, he announced, his voice ringing with finality. He then looked directly at Silas, his eyes cold. Silas, you will cease and desist all contact. Mr. Vance's legal adoption of the children is ratified. Any attempt to contact or threaten Mrs. Vance or her daughters will result in immediate arrest and forfeiture of all your remaining property. The children and the mother are now fully and legally protected. Silas exploded in a storm of curses and impotent rage, but the bailiffs were already moving to restrain him. The tide had turned completely. The law, which had once been his weapon, was now Clara's unbreakable shield. Clara stood, trembling with a powerful mix of relief and triumphant courage. She walked to Eli and gently took her daughter back, then rested her hand on his strong, comforting arm. The fight was over. Justice had prevailed, not through a gun, but through the dignity of their truth and the quiet strength of their commitment. As they walked out of the courtroom, a legally recognized family, leaving the defeated fury of Silas behind them, the sun felt warmer, and the Wyoming air tasted of permanent freedom. The transaction was complete, and the unexpected, enduring love was just beginning. The legal victory against Silas was the true beginning of Eli and Clara's life together. The wedding, initially a strategic necessity, quickly deepened into an abiding, respectful love. Clara's bruises faded, but her courage only intensified. She took ownership of her new role with the same meticulous pride she had shown in the ledgers. She didn't just manage the house. She made it a home warm, efficient, and filled with the laughter of children. The bolted door, once a symbol of fear, became a forgotten piece of history. The girls flourished under Eli's immense, quiet protection. Sarah and Lily learned to ride horses and count cattle, their small hands steady on the reins. They were raised on the unshakable truth that their value was infinite, regardless of their gender. Eli didn't just love them. He respected them, teaching them to trust their instincts and stand up for what was right. The baby, Hope, grew into a bright, cheerful child, never knowing the shadow of Redemption Hole. The Double V Ranch became known throughout the territory, not just for its prize cattle, but for its owner's uncompromising sense of justice. Eli Vance, the giant rancher, was now known as a man who valued character over convention, and who had risked everything to protect a woman and her daughters from profound discrimination. Their story became a bedrock of local community storytelling, a powerful narrative that challenged the region's harsh, patriarchal norms. Clara, now known as Mrs. Vance, was the moral center of the ranch. She taught the ranch hands to use better manners, managed the finances with an iron fist and a clear mind, and became a source of quiet counsel for the wives and families of the ranch hands. She never forgot where she came from, and she used her hard-won position to ensure that no one under the Double V roof suffered injustice or lack of dignity. Years passed. One quiet evening, long after the girls were grown and the Double V was a thriving empire, Eli and Clara sat on the porch swing they had built together. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in hues of deep gold and purple, the very colors that had framed their escape so many years ago. Eli's hair was streaked with gray, and Clara's hands were no longer soft, but strong and competent. Eli pulled a small, worn piece of paper from his pocket. It was the original divorce decree, granted easily after the initial court ruling. He had kept it all these years, tucked away for safekeeping. "You know, Clara," Eli said, his deep voice carrying a lifetime of emotion, "the day I saw you walking away from that alley, holding that tiny bundle, bruised but unbowed, I knew I wasn't just saving you. You were saving me. That day, you forced me to live up to the standard of dignity I'd always pretended to uphold. You brought the true heart into this home." Clara took the paper from him, examining the formal, legal writing that had once held such terror, and now held only triumph. "You gave me a choice, Eli," Clara replied, her voice rich with peaceful certainty. "You looked at a woman who was considered worthless for her daughters, and you offered her the highest honor, respect for her pride. The legal victory, the ranch, the name, all of it was just the shell. The real gift was the courage you returned to me. And in return, I gave you my absolute trust." She looked at the document one last time, then smiled and slowly tore the paper into small, deliberate pieces, letting the pieces fall from the porch to be carried away by the evening breeze. The formal end of the old life didn't matter anymore. The reality was in their shared history, their thriving children, and the unspoken language of their hands. "We built this life, Eli," Clara concluded, resting her head on his broad, comforting shoulder. "Not out of necessity, but out of true resolution. We proved that even in the Wild West, justice for all women and all children is possible, if one giant rancher has the heart and the character to demand it." The sun dipped below the horizon, and the two of them sat in the enveloping twilight, the sounds of the prosperous ranch settling around them. The giant rancher who had said, "Come with me," had not only rescued a mother and her daughters, but had redefined the meaning of family, love, and heroism on the Wyoming plains. Their story would live on, a constant, powerful reminder that the greatest strength is not in the size of a man, but in the dignity he is willing to protect. Eli and Clara settled into an old age marked by simple, profound closeness. Their love wasn't a whirlwind. It was the slow, steady warmth of the parlor stove in winter. They still sat on the porch swing every evening, not always speaking, but always present. One summer evening, as a spectacular lightning storm rolled across the plains, they watched the powerful display from the porch. Clara turned to Eli, her hand resting on his massive arm. "Do you remember the moment I walked to your wagon?" she asked, her voice soft with reflection. "I was broken, but I was so angry. I knew if I didn't walk, those girls would never know anything but fear. That anger saved us." Eli nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant storm. "I remember the courage in your walk, Clara. It wasn't just fear you were running from. It was a refusal to be defined by cruelty. And that night, I didn't just promise you safety in my house. I promised you a partnership that would prove you were right to demand more. The love came later, but the respect was instantaneous." Their entire life was a testament to the idea that the greatest human connections are built not on initial attraction, but on a shared, uncompromising commitment to moral justice.